Thank you, Yana. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Academy tonight. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I want to thank you for coming to tonight's panel discussion. It is entitled, What Comes Next? Imagining a New Economic and Security Commons with Condoleezza Rice and Philip Zelikow. And this is the conclusion, the final act, as it were, of a workshop that we've had today in which we explored the all too abundant economic and security challenges we all face now and discussed what might come after the current turbulences in the transatlantic space. We will dig right into that, but I wanted to, first of all, to thank our partners from the Hoover Institution, which is led by Dr. Rice, for this cooperation, and just say we had a really extraordinary set of conversations today. I am going to skip trying to mention all of the participants because I'll inevitably forget someone, but I will just say that Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was here. He had to leave, unfortunately. We had 3 Academy trustees in the room, Emily Haber, Leah Zell, and Wolfgang Ischinger. Unfortunately, Wolfgang's no longer here anymore. And one person who certainly should be named who is here is Ambassador Susan McCaw, who is the chairman of the board of the Hoover Institution. So it is a wonderful evening when we get to have 2 people who have lots of history with the Academy up here on the dais, as it were, on the riser. Condoleezza Rice, as I think all of you already know, was the 66th Secretary of State of the United States from 2005 to 2009. She is a distinguished scholar, public intellectual. As I mentioned, she currently is the director of the Hoover Institution. She has been provost of Stanford and professor of political science. She was a director. You went from director on the NSC staff to national security advisor.
No, I went to senior director.
Oh, you did get to be a senior.
I was a senior director in the last years of George H.W.
Okay,
Bush.
all right.
We're going back.
All right. Today she is the Tad and Dianne Taube director of the Hoover Institution and the Thomas and Barbara Stephenson Senior Fellow on Public Policy. Philip Zelikow, to my left, was a fellow at the American Academy in 2009. And although that's something we'll boast about, he's actually done many other important things. He is the Botha-Chan Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And there he focuses on critical episodes in world history, challenges of policy, design, and statecraft. For 25 years, he was a professor of history at the University of Virginia, where he also directed the Miller Center, one of our country's leading research centers on the American presidency. Philip has an extraordinary record in Washington. He was on the National Security Council staff. He was counselor at the State Department. He directed the 9/11 Commission report and is one of the kind of essential people in the policy establishment, I would say. So I'm going to just give you a little roadmap. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. And if you are with us, you know how to ask a question with the hand up and all that. And if you're joining us via Vimeo, please type your question in the Q&A box of the website. So I'm delighted to have you both here. And I'm going to start off, Philip, because you were so kind to think about coming to the Academy to have this conversation, to ask you to just outline what it is you wanted to discuss today and what's on your mind.
So we started from the premise that the world order that, yes, thank you for reminding me.
I think.
Great. Can you hear me all right? Yes. So we started the session today starting from the premise that the world order that Condi and I played a small part in helping to build at the beginning of the 1990s, a global commonwealth, is an order that's now broken down and probably is irretrievable. I view that with some regret. I think that order actually generally served the world well for a number of years. The reasons why it broke down were not the main focus of our discussion today. Instead, what we wanted to do is envision what comes next. We are in a period of turbulent transition, and we wanted to look beyond admiring the problem and wringing our hands to ask ourselves, where do we want this to go? Say 1, 2, 3 years from now. What kind of partnerships do we want to have? What kind of relations do we want to have? What kind of countries should we become? Should we aspire to become? And then what are the concrete choices that we're going to need to make soon, like in the next 6 to 12 months, in order to hold on to that vision, preserve what we can as we ride out this period of crisis and prepare for a different kind of relationship a few years from now. And a big part of the conversation this afternoon actually was not just talking about dry stuff about different conditions of international relations and fanciful abstractions of world order. A lot of the discussion was about what's the narrative of hope for our societies looking forward into the late 2020s and the 2030s. What's the narrative of hope and opportunity that might inspire and animate young people to think positively about the future? And what's that narrative for Germany? What's that narrative for the United States? And if Connie and I both think that we can't go it alone and we have to work together, that's why we're here in Berlin, to have this conversation, and that Germany is pivotal in it. And so as we think about the narratives for our societies, in a way, the world order narratives should grow out of that, should spill over from that, as our visions converge and overlap in ways where we can see places we need to work with each other, that we can convince our own societies are in our interest to get what we want for our people. So that was where the discussion was focused this afternoon. That's why we came here, is rather than just wringing our hands at admiring the problem, we wanted to join some key Germans and actually some British leaders who joined us today in talking through where do we want to go as we come out of kind of after the flood, so to speak. Where do we want to end up? And what are the near-term choices we need to be looking at in order to preserve our options for getting there and managing the crises in front of us right now?
Well, we would be, I think, remiss if we didn't tell the audience a little bit about why we think we're in the current mess. And you spoke very eloquently about the set of problems that you thought had really propelled us into the polycrisis, to use your word, to use Adam Tooze's word, that we have. So maybe you want to fill in a bit of that.
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks very much to the American Academy for having us. And we've had really very intense discussions today, and I think very open discussions, which I think is only appropriate among allies. And this is a great place to do that. So thank you very much, Dan. So how did we get here? Well, as Philip said, we believe that the system of the last 80 years or so, which envisioned an international economy that would not be zero sum, where my growth did not have to come at your expense. And so we believed in free trade and capital flows, and we believed in we didn't have to compete violently for resources. You could actually trade for them. These were the lessons of the interwar period, which had broken down into a Great Depression, into a war, because those elements were not there. And really, the idea that you would have an international system that was that was positive sum was a kind of radical idea. But indeed, we pulled it off. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, those countries joined. And then, of course, the big change was when China entered the international economy in a major way with its accession to the WTO in 2001. That economic commons, as we have called it, was accompanied by a security commons, largely provided by the United States along with its allies. I've always thought it remarkable that when the Soviet Union exploded a nuclear weapon 5 years ahead of schedule in 1949, that same year, the United States took a pledge that an attack upon one is an attack upon all. And it really said, we will, if necessary, trade Washington for Paris or New York for London. What an extraordinary expression of America's willingness to carry the security, to be the shield, if you will, for democracy. And then, of course, the defense treaty with Japan, taking the security of South Korea after the Korean War, and then ultimately defense of the sea lanes and the like. So the United States became a kind of shield. That system was terrific in a lot of ways. I think that the benefits, the growth that it provided, the prosperity that it provided, but the growth and prosperity were very diffuse. You can look out at international growth and see it. But the first problem is there were some very concentrated areas of pain, because not everybody benefited equally from globalization. If you look at the unemployed coal miner in West Virginia, or the unemployed steel worker in Great Britain, it didn't work so well. And so for those people, it became a matter of seeking somebody to blame, but also an explanation for why they failed. And I think that's one of the reasons that you've seen populism arise. Secondly, China, which was a very big part of that system, never fully integrated into it. But rather, there became a sense that the Chinese, particularly under Xi Jinping, were taking advantage of the system to build military, economic, and technological power that would compete with the United States, in fact, conflict with the United States and its allies throughout the world. I've often said that we had an idea of what China was going to become, and it wasn't that it was going to be a Jeffersonian democracy. I don't think anybody believed that. But we did believe that there was going to be a liberalization. And there was a saying that we had, which is that you cannot have economic liberalization and political control. For a while, that looked like precisely what was happening. You were having great private companies being born in China, the Alibabas and the Tencents of the world. China once led the world in online startups for education. And I worked with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, and for the most part, we were able to work together on things like North Korea. Now, I am not a great man theory of international relations, but if there's one great man who changed that dynamic, it would have been Xi Jinping. And for Xi Jinping, the one answer that we didn't expect to, you cannot have economic liberalization and political control, is, thank you very much, I'll take political control. And we didn't really expect that answer. And as a result, and a rather competitive or conflictual view of China's role in the world, you started to get a backlash in the United States against this kind of integration of China. And then there was one final part of that, which was that the technological arms race really is there in every aspect of this. If you think about the frontier technologies that we are now facing, AI or quantum computing or synthetic biology or robotics, these are transformational technologies. A friend of mine who's an AI specialist calls them civilizational technologies. And to have an arms race effectively now with an adversary in China, which is the technological, economic, and military, increasingly military peer of the United States, is a huge challenge. Now, enter to that the last few years, when I think there have been questions about America's resolve to remain the protector of both the economic and the security commons. And I don't have to repeat the stories about NATO and the like, but I just want to say the following. I do think that you should not underestimate the degree to which in the United States there has grown a kind of sense of weariness at some of the obligations of maintaining the global economic and security commons. It perhaps best expresses itself in the discussions about unfair trade and therefore a move to tariffs. It expresses itself in something that's been going on for a very long time, which is why don't others do more for their own security? And finally, now, with NATO's decision to go to 5% and the very important decisions here in Germany to increase defense spending and defense capability, I think we finally have an answer to those who have been saying in the United States, we just can't do this alone any longer. I just want you to understand that this is not just the current president. These are trends that have been developing for some time. They're very deep. They will be there who is ever in the White House. And I'll just give you one final little vignette to demonstrate this. In 2016, when Hillary Clinton ran against Donald Trump was against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But in the election, so was Hillary Clinton, who had negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That lets you know a little bit about what the mood was like in the United States. So don't expect that there will be a sudden reversal if we have a change in the White House. That's why Philip and I, and thank you to the American Academy to give us the space to do it, believe that it's important with our friends, our longtime friends and allies who share our values, to start to look at how we can accommodate these underlying trends in the building of a new security and economic commons that will still maintain some of the core values and some of the core intentions of the earlier commons, which is that the global economy and global security would be cooperative, at least among like-minded states.
So if I can ask one quick follow-up on that. There are lots of people in the US, I think we have 3 of them right up here, who would say that, yes, certainly the fruits of globalization were not distributed equally or in some cases not equitably, but that the US benefited enormously from being the power that upheld the international order. And I think most of us thought that the costs, particularly because we spend a lot of defense regardless, were not that exorbitant. How did we, the foreign policy establishment, fail at getting that message across?
Well, let me just say, in the American foreign policy establishment, I do think the disproportionate share of the security burden was starting to wear kind of thin.
That is true.
I can't tell you how many times I went to Brussels begging for the 2%. And every American Secretary of State and every American National Security Advisor and every American president would have that experience. So
that's all true. I agree with
that's
that.
been going on for a while. But I think that when we thought about globalization, perhaps I would put it not so much about inequality, but the kind of growing distance or felt distance between what elites were talking about in globalization and what common people were seeing from globalization. If I give you just an example, a kind of very vivid one, when I teach a course at the Stanford School of Business, which I do, I will inevitably have the student with the following characteristics. Born in Brazil, went to college at Oxford, first job was in Shanghai, now in graduate school at Stanford, next job will be in Dubai, moves easily around the world. And therefore, globalization was his or her home. Most people never move more than 25 miles from where they were born. And their aspirations and their expectations and their cultural norms were different. And there was a sense that that separation, that elites had started to actually even make fun of so-called common people. The sense that in the United States, when John Kennedy said bear any burden and pay any cost in his inaugural address, that was fine when the $18 an hour unskilled labor job was available. But when it had moved to some other place, now you were left with an economy that did not provide in the same way for those people. And I've said that produced what I've called the four horsemen of the apocalypse: populism, nativism, anti-immigration, nativism, isolationism, and protectionism. And they tend to ride together. And they're riding not just in the United States. You know that they're riding in Germany. They're riding in Great Britain. They're riding all over. And so I think that's what happened. We lost sight of that difference.
Interesting. Philip, a new commons. In the conversation today, exactly what Dr. Rice said, it was emphasized that the international system as it existed from 1945 on was founded on cooperative efforts that sought to avoid any of the evils of the past: warfare, seizure of others' property, dominance of the strong over the weak, and so on and so forth. The choice of words, a new commons, won't it inevitably have a lot of the same characteristics of the one we have now, and that will have, to use that radioactive phrase, a rules-based order? There may be somewhat different roles and responsibilities, but there is an element of recreation here, is there not?
There's an element of recreation in the sense that we think the fundamental idea that free societies around the world need to work together if they want to build an open and civilized world to live in, that they can't go it alone. The fundamental dangerous drift here is if you do nothing, we're going to drift into neo-imperial spheres of influence. And then for countries that aren't powerful, it'll almost be, the weak must do what they must. And that's a real danger of fragmentation into all against all, and then these powerful states just taking care of themselves. And we fundamentally think that world is not a favorable world for free and open societies, that the odds for free and open societies go down in such a world. Therefore, we think that somehow you need to reconceive relationships in which we work together. I can make that very concrete. Let's just, one crucial issue right now is, say, the AI revolution and the production and management of frontier technologies that are going to transform our lives in the next maybe as little as 5 to 10 years. So, just question. Is this something the United States can and should manage on its own? After all, it has a certain technological dominance in frontier technologies. Our view is that ideally, no. That actually we will be better off, the United States will be better off in both in the production and management of these vital frontier technologies if we work with key other free societies, including in the production of the frontier technologies. The United States is not entirely self-sufficient in any aspect of that supply chain. And actually, if we work with other free societies, there's a chance that together we can guide the development and management of these frontier technologies in a way that serves free and open societies. We are not confident that that's actually what China will do with frontier technologies. And there's nothing they've done that would give you that confidence. So that's a choice. If the United States will just do this on its own and you people figure out what you're going to do, in a way, you're making it less likely that the values of free and open societies will help chart the direction of the frontier technologies that will shape our lives. So that's a very concrete illustration that you can break that down into very specific things having to do with, development of 2 nanometer technologies and the roles of German firms like Bosch or Zeiss, or Dutch firms, or British firms like ARM, and so on. Yet, we're in a situation right now where 90% of the cutting edge frontier technologies rely on a supply chain ecosystem centered in Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. 90%. That's a level of geographic dependence on a technology at the pivot of world history that is unprecedented in the history of the world. The geographic concentration of coal resources was never so extreme. The geographic concentration of oil resources was never so extreme. So then how can the United States think that it's going to thrive in the development of frontier technologies while remaining more or less indifferent to what happens in Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan? By the way, the notion that Germany can remain indifferent to the fate of Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan is that, well, if China controls Germany's access to frontier technologies, that's okay. Germany will be fine in that world. Well, you have to think about that. You see, that reconceives the way you think. Then if you say, I'm not sure I like that, then you ask, all right, what's the coalition then that needs to work together to offer a different vision? And you begin to immediately see the shape of that answer. So I started from that high level of abstraction, the belief that we need to avoid the simple drift into national neo-imperial paradigms. And I carried it down actually to a fairly somewhat concrete illustration, an example that I think all of you can relate to.
So a follow-up question to that. You talk about a drift to neo-imperialism. As a daily reader of the newspaper, I feel like we're driving towards that with someone behind the wheel who thinks that 2 or 3 enormous spheres of influence would be just dandy. And so how, other than by being extraordinarily compelling, does this project deal with that challenge?
Well, partly, number one, of course, by being extraordinarily compelling.
Yeah.
Actually, I think the argument I just made a minute ago goes a little distance there. But look, I actually am not going to give a lecture to this audience about the American president. The American president is an open book. All of you can read the book. The letters are large. They're pictures. But actually, what's really happening in the United States is the president, and actually a lot of people who work for the president, the administration is divided. The president is conflicted. The president has a variety of impulses, but one of his impulses is he actually wants to be the leader of the free world, too. Now, then there are responsibilities and duties that sometimes go with that, which he's also aware of. And so there's a lot of variation depending on a lot of things, okay? Our goal, though, in our conversations are not to get caught up in these daily vagaries. Is, okay, let's spot some particular topics where concretely we can make that compelling case. And we can make that compelling case to like every faction in the Trump administration, for example. So can we just focus on these things where cooperation is clearly vital? If the answer is yes, let's start working that cooperation. And then as you build up bases and cores of cooperation, you begin to see how that helps you navigate the transition and maybe build the odds that you're going to get to a better world on the other side with this vision. So I'm not trying to, minimize the current turbulence. But in a way, rather than just throwing up your hands in helplessness, it's like, okay, well, what do you want to do about it? What we want to do about it is, okay, let's work on what we can work on. Like even in the US-EU trade deal, for example, with its tariffs. It's Zollpolitik, to borrow the German phrase. Notice that they laid out like half a dozen sectors that would be tariff-free, where even in that initial framework, they acknowledged where we were clearly going to have to cooperate. And then you think, how do you build on that in order to basically drive this so that as the dust settles, we begin to see the terms and character of a different kind of partnership that actually will feel relevant to ordinary people as they're going forward into the new era.
Now, I would just add that I think we have a case, Philip mentioned the frontier technologies, where we really have a lot of work to do because decisions are already being made. The international politics actually doesn't proceed as people sit around and draw boxes and then you create a system and that system comes into being. There are decisions that get made that constrain what that system can look like. And if I look at the decisions around, let's take AI at this particular point, one of my concerns is I don't think that the United States and its allies are on the same page about AI. I don't think we're on the same page about frontier technologies in general, but it's showing up most fervently in AI. What do I mean by that? I think that there is an undercurrent in the United States. I live in Silicon Valley. I've lived in Silicon Valley since I was 25 years old. So I kind of understand the gestalt of the place a bit. And people will put it the following way. The United States innovates and Europe regulates. Now, we can't let that continue to be the situation or we're going to get driven further and further apart. And this is especially important at a time when I think the United States is suddenly feeling the shock of how far China has come in AI. So that the old notion that we could export control our way out of Chinese progress because we were so far ahead and we could kind of close the barn door, that is being exploded now as a myth. And just to illustrate it, so when DeepSeek came out, there was not a national security person on the planet who wasn't absolutely stunned. There was not a computer scientist who was at all surprised because they had been following what was going on in China and they knew that they were adapting to the fact that they did not have access to certain chips, or at least not to a lot of them. And so China is moving very quickly into a position that in some areas it exceeds the capacity of the United States. And so I don't think we want to be in a position where we're fighting with our allies every day about how to regulate something that is moving very, very quickly. So that's also a place that we might work together.
So the conversation today was a little bit of ping pong in a sense, in that we went back and forth from talking about the U.S., talking about Germany. You have been involved with Germany throughout your professional life, and I was just curious if you would, if there were any surprises to you today. I think Germany in the last few months has really had a kind of remarkable awakening, and I'd be interested in how that came across to you.
Well, it's one thing to read about it and to hear the speeches. It's quite another to feel it and to have the sense that Germany has actually made a turning point in its recognition of the importance, particularly in the security sector, but to take more responsibility for security, that has not just a rhetorical element, but there's real work to be done, that it is going to cost money, thus the important decisions about debt, and that it has to be done. And I've heard two versions of it. One is we can do it. The other is we probably try to do it with the United States. I prefer the second of those. But it's you sense it, and if you talk to people who are even our diplomats, as Phil and I did this morning, the sense of the seriousness of this turn for Germany comes through. And I was saying earlier, so I was on the little team that did German unification back in 89, 90, 91. And what was very clear from that was that President George H.W. Bush, and I think it would be true of subsequent presidents, fully trusts German democracy and fully trusts a leadership role for Germany within the European Union and a leadership role internationally. And so from my point of view, it became a matter of, boy, how can we get more of that? And so I understand that there are, we all have constraints, but what really comes across to me is the fundamentally important role of Germany and how it's evolving to a place that I think it could make a huge difference in developing a commons rather than Philip's more catastrophic view of these imperial areas of concentration.
So, Philip, two questions for you. First of all, your gloss on what you heard today about where Germany is. And then secondly, if you would situate that enormous challenge that we're all dealing with, Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression in Ukraine, in the matrix of this effort to create a new commons.
Sure. Oliver, just on the question of what did I take away about Germany today? I'll just borrow a couple of comments that were made by German participants who I will not name. First comment was just the scale of the shocks Germany has suffered in recent years cumulatively. I said, are we talking about kind of another Stunde Null? Right? No, well, maybe not quite that. Maybe instead of Stunde Null, it's Stunde Eins. But plainly, a level of cumulative shocks that are requiring Germany to rethink its place, its business model, in ways that hasn't been true perhaps in generations. So that was one clear message. Another clear message is that Germans are awakening to their decisive significance in thought leadership and strategic leadership in the whole fate of Europe in these matters. That the Germans themselves may not realize quite how important they are. If Germany does not make the right choices in kind of guiding not only itself, but a lot of other developed countries in a situation where the Americans are where they are, who's going to offer the leadership instead? And the answer is not obvious. Germany is facing this extraordinary crossroads in its own history, at the same time that it has an extraordinary opportunity and importance, perhaps at a level of world history. I was recounting the story during the discussion today that Germany actually played a really crucial role in shaping the whole rebooting of freedom and capitalism in the late 1970s and early 1980s. A lot of the stories about the end of the Cold War are told in a very American-centric way. And in fact, a lot of the key decisions actually were European decisions. The decisions to move to a hard money policy to crush inflation first emanated out of Germany and France and were forced on the United States by German monetary policy in 1978. It was West Europeans who decided to do the Single European Act that rejuvenated West Europe's prospects, made West Europe so enticing to Eastern Europe. It was Gorbachev was eyeing Western Europe, not the American example, in animating a lot of his reforms. It was because Western Europe itself was turning around from the malaise of the 1970s, led by Europeans, led by Germans. So this is really a key moment to take away about where Germany is, both in the level of shocks, where Germany is in the important role it can play. That's a big part of what I took away about the situation. Now, as this relates to Ukraine, Ukraine is a test case. By the way, you can look at all the risks of doing things to help Ukraine in certain ways. I'm very involved in the issue of Russian assets and have argued for 3.5 years that we ought to move on the issue of Russian assets. It's very hard. It's technically complicated. There are risks. If you don't move on Russian assets and Ukraine goes down, the consequences will be enormous. Enormous. The millions of refugees, an economic implosion in the eastern half of Europe that drags down Europe's general economic prospects. If instead you salvage Ukraine's prospects, you make it the focus of hundreds of billions of dollars of investment, Eastern Europe actually becomes a center of rejuvenation and growth. It animates a whole different possible future in the European model. Boy, the choice between those two pathways is a big choice, even aside from all the obvious military security issues, which you're all familiar with and know very well. So then there's the question of what role Germany can play in that. Germany has a crucial role to play on all the economic issues and financial issues like the one I just mentioned. And the financial issues increasingly overlap with the defense issues, since a lot of the arms have to be paid for with cash. The British and French did a historic thing in the last year, and some of our conversations helped spur that work. The British and French created this reassurance force and coalition of the willing. They did that, please notice, without American leadership, without even American thought leadership. The British and French pretty much led the way, and Germans are now joining them in that leadership position. A year ago, in September of 2024, no one would have anticipated that the staff work for a reassurance force would exist. No one anticipated the existence of this coalition of the willing. All right, true. It's only in the context of a possible peace agreement. But that work has already advanced further than anyone thought possible. And once you've done that work, you've created habits of cooperation that overlap with NATO, but go beyond NATO, that before they did it, no one thought was possible. You're already moving in these constructive directions. And so you can see that in both financial issues and defense matters, the tasks may seem forbidding, even overwhelming, but they're not hopeless. And you're facing a crossroads where you can create a pathway of hope and opportunity for Europe or another path.
Did you have anything you wanted to add on Ukraine?
Just that I do think we, hindsight is 20/20, but there was a moment when the Russians were completely on their back foot. They thought this war was going to take 5 days. By the way, a lot of Western intelligence agencies did too. They were, the kind of image of it is that convoy that got stuck, because the Russians are actually really bad on offense, and they weren't prepared. But because we kind of did it incrementally, we debated tanks, then we gave tanks. We debated HIMARS, then we gave HIMARS. It gave them a chance to go back and depend on what they've always depended on, which is their mass. And yet, with all of the effort, I knew Vladimir Putin pretty well. And I remember one day sitting in his office, he told me, Condi, Russia's only been great when it's been ruled by great men, like Peter the Great and Alexander II. Now, he didn't say Stalin, he didn't say Lenin, he also didn't say Catherine. She was a woman, so I guess that didn't count. But it tells you who he is. He's a Russian imperialist, and there cannot be a Russian empire with an independent Ukraine. So in his mind, he's got to crush Ukraine. And I think it explains why, even though when the Trump administration first came in, Steve Witkoff was putting things on the table that made me a little nervous. You've got Crimea, you've got the East, you've got no membership in it. It was only, I was worried we were going to say, and you can, think about who the president of Ukraine, they didn't go there. But he didn't take that deal. And I think it's because in his mind, he can't believe he can't crush this little thing that he doesn't even consider to be, he told us once it was a made-up country. So it's hard to figure what will change his mind. And the only thing that I think will change his mind, because I think this next 8 weeks or so before the fighting season is over, he's going to throw everything he can at Ukraine. You're seeing the bombings and the drones and the missiles at Kyiv, even out now in Lviv, which had been basically pretty safe. He's trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people. And so my view is we've got to throw everything at him in response. And that's why I favor the using the assets in whatever form we can do that. But I also think that there's one thing that might get his attention, and that's the Russian oil and gas industry. It is the source of his power. It is the source of his personal wealth. And the Russian oil and gas industry is in pretty bad shape. I was an oil company director. If you do not maintain your pipes and your refineries every single day, then they start to exponentially degrade. And they are harvesting the money from sales to fight the war, and the infrastructure is degrading. There was a memo that was leaked from Gazprom last year that said Gazprom will not be profitable again until 2036. I think that was a cry for help from the oil and gas industry. So the one thing that might get his attention is to allow the Ukrainians to continue to go after the oil and gas infrastructure, maybe even encourage them to go after it even more, and to see what you can do to accelerate the decline in the oil and gas infrastructure in Russia.
Do we know if the author of that memo is still with us?
There were an incredible number of people that seemed to be very clumsy when they were standing by windows. I don't know, but I do know that even his very fine central banker gave a very dark report on the Russian economy at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. But she keeps trying to quit. He keeps not letting her because she's a very fine financial engineer. I'm not saying that that Russia is near the end of its rope. It's not. But I read the following numbers the other day. At the opening of the war, they had 7% of Ukrainian territory. They have spent $1.5 trillion. They have killed 300,000 people, soldiers. They have 1 million casualties. 1 million people have left the country. They've lost 25% of their bomber force because of what the Ukrainians did. And they have gained 12 to 14% of Ukrainian territory. That just shows what a slog this has been. So I think, I don't know if he can be convinced, but maybe this is the time to try.
It does seem like he's staked his regime on it, and that, of course, is
Russia doesn't deal well with czars who lose wars.
No.
That's their history.
All right, why don't we open it up to the audience? I'm sure you all have a million questions, some of which may be on point, some of which won't. I would just ask you when you have your question, make sure there's a question mark at the end, right there. Wait for the mic.
Yeah, thanks. So I would like to ask a question for your comments on the frontier technologies. So I'm in the frontier technologies, but not in the AI. I use it, but so Phil, your comment was we use some common sense in Europe and US to move AI forward. I completely agree. We have the AI Act in US now, and then Connie, you made the comment China is pushing us, especially US, to say, okay, now we go the regulatory way. I agree in Europe, or you go the open way. But that is a conflict. We may see also in other frontier technologies that a country like China drives US, in the end also Europe, to go their own ways. Is it right?
It is right. And I'm glad you mentioned other technologies because we talk a lot about AI. But actually, the frontier technologies are more appropriately thought of AI and. So AI and robotics, AI and synthetic biology. And since if you look at something like robotics, if you talk to Stanford scientists, for instance, about their robots, guess where they're coming from? Because the Chinese are so far ahead in cheap robots that can do certain tasks. And so I do think that we're being pushed. My own view is that we move hard and fast. We worry later about regulation. I'm almost libertarian in my views of the frontier technologies. But I do think that if we could, as Philip said, put our forces together, we would have a better chance of fighting off what is a real challenge from China. I actually wrote a piece that was really challenging the idea that this was Cold War II. And I remind people that the Soviet Union was a military giant, but it was a technological and economic midget. We haven't had an adversary that checks all of those boxes in a very long time, and China does. And when you think of how much it took for us to push back the Soviet Union, pushing back China is going to be a much taller task, and I would very much like to have the the Alliance of Free Peoples to do it.
Could I add just briefly that I think Germany will need to confront, as it faces this historic crossroads, a cultural crossroads in its attitude towards risk. There's a historic risk aversion in the society, a historic risk aversion that's inhibited business finance, and a huge empowerment of business finance in Germany will be essential to the innovative transformation that's needed. And I think to inspire your young people and to inspire the transformation that's needed, Germans will have to actually look to their strengths, look to the quality and talent and latent energy in their people, and harness that in maybe a new attitude towards risk. Managed risk, of course, but a sense of possibility, not just the long shadow of the World War II generation.
You also have to realize that risk, I'll tell you a little story. So when Dmitry Medvedev came to Stanford, President Obama actually called me and he said, could you make sure he has a good visit? This was, I think, in 2011. And I said, sure. So he came and he looked very much the young techie. He had on his blue jeans, he had his Armani jacket, he read his speech from an iPad. And so afterwards I had a little lunch for him with some of the venture capitalists. And one craggly old venture capitalist who'd been there forever said, well, he goes, 9 out of 10 things that I ventured failed. And you could see in Medvedev's face, so why'd they invite this guy? And he said, but then once in a while you get a Microsoft. That attitude that it's okay to have failure because you learn from it, and that failure is not a mark against you, but actually that you have some experience, accompanies the idea that you can take risks, because now you can take risks without feeling that your career is over.
It's also a pregnant moment, because I think we're going to see a lot of people who are coming out of a culture in which there's lots of risk and lots of fascinating research, and they're looking for their homes right now as we see more and more people applying to all of Europe's top institutions for teaching positions, research positions, and the like, because of the atmosphere in the U.S. right now.
Well, I think, let me just say, though, look, ultimately, they will want to be in the United States if they want to do technology. So let's not get too far out on that, Dan. I think you're going to find that on things like visas for H-1B, that actually there are an awful lot of people in the White House who understand that problem and are pretty big proponents of H-1B. I think where we have a problem is that we've tended on the immigration issue to just talk about immigration without talking about different kinds of immigration. Yeah.
Over here. Oh.
Thank you very much for your comments today. I'm Dr. Malcolm Jorgensen from the Max Planck Institute for International Law. So in 2019, you actually wrote a book together called To Build a Better World, which drew upon your expertise as scholars and diplomats to assess the world and look forward to construct a better world. Yet, when each of you actually held the levers of power in Washington during the Bush 43 administration, you oversaw decisions which are widely considered by many scholars and increasingly by the public as catastrophically miscalculating the nature of the threat posed by Iraq, but especially of America's role in upholding the global order. That is, that the institutions which were set aside, such as the United Nations during that time, are part of the story of the breakdown in the global order. And just to take one specific example, Secretary Rice, you talked about the wariness of America's resolve to be protecting of order. And of course, that's directly been related to the Iraq war in recent elections. And so the statement that I'm now struck by, Professor Zelikow, is that the reasons that the order broke down were not actually discussed in today. And so that seems like a non-starter for this discussion that first needs to be considered. And so my basic question, which I think it's eminently fair to put, is why do you nevertheless remain credible voices in speaking about this new global commons, given the history of your own contributions to the breakdown of the current global order? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you'll have to decide whether we're credible voices. And frankly, you can decide whatever you'd like from my point of view. We can talk about Iraq. We've covered that territory quite a lot. You might have noticed that there were actually quite a few UN Security Council resolutions. You want to talk about order that Saddam Hussein was in violation of when that action was taken. I'd also suggest that maybe you go take a look at Iraq today, that you look at the fact that Iraq has been removed as a threat in the Middle East, and that the Iraqis are now integrating into the Arab world. So, sometimes these things take time. And maybe one of the things that we understand as people who've studied history and people who have been involved in history is not to make judgments too quickly. Now, secondly, I would say to you that if you're going to hold positions like we have held, you're going to have some ups and downs. You're going to make some mistakes. You're going to do some things well. And for those of us who also live in the academic world, to have people who are academics and can sit and not have to make decisions, be so critical of those who have to actually make decisions, is something that I really understand. And I tell my academic colleagues, policy making's really hard. And until you've done it, don't be so critical.
Phil, I know you're dying to jump in here.
I think that's enough. We should go to the next question.
Okay, next question on this side of the house.
Condoleezza Rice said that one thing that would be important would be to go after Russia's oil and gas industry. My name is Jason Kirkpatrick. I work with Rosenweistan, a Ukrainian group. We advocate for stronger sanctions. So you've spoken on this clearly, but right here and now and today, especially given that drones have violated this airspace of Poland and Romania in recent days. So Germany buys roughly, give or take a few percent, 5% of its LNG gas from Russia today, imported through Belgium. So what would you say to Germany? What would you say to Europe? What would you say to the President of the United States to do this concretely? What concrete things should be done in terms of sanctions, secondary sanctions? What would be low-hanging fruit? I'd appreciate to hear a couple of minutes of your opinion.
Sure. I think one of the problems is there really is no low-hanging fruit when one talks about secondary sanctions. I'm frankly a little concerned about what has happened with India as a result of having singled out India for secondary sanctions. Remember, we've spent the last 25 years trying to invite India into our commons instead of into the Russian commons. And I think we've had some, the way that the tariffs were imposed kind of under the secondary sanctions notion has really done some damage to that relationship. And I'm hoping that it can be repaired. I think the reason you're not really seeing secondary sanctions on China, or that the administration is perhaps a little bit reluctant, is because they're also in very delicate negotiations with China on trade matters. And so, secondary sanctions often sound good. But when you actually start thinking about their effects, they may be very hard to justify if you look at the larger system, which is why I emphasized in this case that if you could continue to do whatever you can in terms of degrading the Russian oil and gas capability. The Ukrainians have turned out to be pretty good at doing some of that. I don't know how much more they could do, but I suspect there's more that they could do. The other thing is maybe to try to get countries voluntarily to think about whether they really need to be dependent on cheap Russian oil and gas. Now, I understand that the winter is coming and people want sources of cheap gas and oil. But, it was a little bit that thinking that got Germany into dependence on Russian natural gas before. And it is for that reason that it's been much more painful to get off of that dependence when it became very clear that it was going to be one of Vladimir Putin's war cards against Germany. So sometimes the long view is don't take the short-term benefit of cheap oil and gas, because the long-term consequences may be quite grave.
So I'll just say that I think the emphasis in Trump's demand that Europe impose secondary sanctions is a strategic mistake. That is, I actually think even if Europe adopted these notional 100% tariffs, which it will not, I don't think actually America will adopt them either. I think this is kind of a performative exercise. Even if that happened, I don't think China and India under those circumstances would change their policies on purchasing Russian oil because they're not going to buckle to such pressure. They'll double down rather than buckle to such pressure. And I also don't think that the center of gravity in the Ukraine war is how much more pain we can put on Vladimir Putin in that way, although Condi's point about the significance of their oil and gas industry is right. The center of gravity in this war is the resilience of Ukrainian society in a war of attrition. The center of gravity in the war is whether the Ukrainian society basically thinks that they can adopt a narrative that's hopeful or a narrative of growing despair. Putin is gambling that the narrative of growing despair will cause that society to implode domestically over the next year or so. And that's why he believes right now he's winning the war. So if you want to change the narrative, you have to change the narrative for the Ukrainian people. And there are things that can be done on the security side and on the financial side that show that people are behind them and that they're going to have the staying power to continue. That then gives Putin the message that Ukraine is going to be able to continue. They're bucked up. Then all the problems in his society may perhaps give us a chance of changing his views.
Can I just ask you both a follow-on? Since you were in government, the resort to sanctions as a fundamental tool of American diplomacy has kind of multiplied many-fold. I mean, we always did sanctions, but it seems to have become the tool, for the most part, of first and last resort now. And I'm wondering if you feel that this has all gone too far, or is it an inevitability when you have the kind of economic power that the United States has?
Well, I think the problem is that when you're in those positions, you don't have too many tools. And when you think about what Russia did in trying to extinguish its smaller neighbor, right?
Not talking about Russia.
No. But I'm just, but it's the point is, Dan, that when you think about what they did, you're not going to go to war with them. And so the question is, what do you do? So you have sanctions. We had sanctions on North Korea for ages. I'm not sure how much it did to arrest North Korean nuclear development, but it's almost a sense of you don't have very many tools. And the one set of sanctions that can be very effective are American 311 Treasury sanctions, because when those are imposed, they have a tertiary effect that if you are listed as an entity under 311 sanctions, if you do business with that entity, then you essentially can't do business in the United States. So when we imposed those on Iran, for instance, the Iranians were not able to get companies to do business with them because they feared being cut out of the United States. So that's one set of sanctions I think that has been pretty effective. But yeah, I accept that they're not always effective, but it's kind of a little bit, what else will you do?
As that famous old joke about the State Department, don't just do something, stand there. So I mean, you've got to have another alternative. I think I'm thinking primarily though about secondary sanctions, which in an extreme case like Ukraine, you can understand. But I think most of our German friends here, secondary sanctions are still considered a violation of international law and cause an awful lot of problems.
Well, American 311. Has been called, in fact, secondary sanctions. But I remember when we were thinking about what we were going to do with Iran, Hank Paulson, who was at the time the Treasury Secretary, told us that we should be very careful. He called them the nuclear weapon of financial sanctions. And he said you shouldn't use them unless there is clear evidence of terrorism, supporting terrorism, or proliferation. And so I actually think you'd find that 311 sanctions have been used very carefully.
Next question. Right over here.
Thank you, Secretary Rice and Pope Philip. I'm Marlies. I'm from the One Campaign. I'm responsible for global health and government relations. It's nice to see you again. I remember in 2012 at the Global Leadership Summit in Cape Town, you spoke about the courage for leadership and why compassion is nothing to negotiate about. In around early 2000, PEFA was launched, which supported a lot of countries in the global south. Now, Trump has tried to suspend this. The jury is out on that one as he plays in the court. I'm wondering, where does health as security play a part? Because we're seeing majority of, say, African countries, even in South America, are gravitating towards China as a result of what we're seeing in America happening. Thank you.
Well, thank you. The first thing I'll say is I think you probably know, because of my role in the Bush administration, that we had an extremely active and deep relationship with the countries of Africa. And that a lot of it was around issues of global health, not just the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS relief, but also maternal health, around malaria, around mother-to-child transmission of AIDS. And it was out of a belief that a healthy population in Africa, particularly given the demographics, young and growing, would be of benefit to the rest of the world. And so the president's decision to make that first $15 billion investment, the good news is that it has now such bipartisan support that, and by the way, I know Secretary Rubio supports it, we've been able to keep it alive. I do think there are questions that people are asking about whether the original intent of PEPFAR, which was to increase the on-the-ground capacity of these countries to handle their own health issues, whether we've fully achieved that. I was told by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the president of Liberia at the time, that when COVID came to Africa, not only were they young populations, but they used a lot of the infrastructure of the clinics and the runners out to the villages to do COVID relief, and really the PEPFAR infrastructure had provided for that. So I'm hoping that this is a place that we stay very active. I think it is in our interest. I think it's in the interest of the world. And I think we have enough bipartisan support to keep going. But I would like to see more on the ground capacity built as we go forward.
I live in mortal fear that I'm missing someone in the back. Is there anyone in the back who has a look at that? Okay.
Thank you both very much. My name is Constance Chochlewski, CEO of Candid Public Affairs. It feels as if it's nearly impossible for the European Union to make any decisions at the moment that are in their strategic best interest. And it seems like there are a few things you mentioned, whether it's Microsoft as a winner of the 10 startups that is incredibly dominant in the European Union, and there's not much the United States is allowing the European Union to do to fight against that. Many other things, we mentioned sanctions on Russia, and we mentioned innovation that needs to occur in Europe, but we just signed or agreed to a framework agreement that is asking for European companies to invest $600 billion in the United States instead of Europe. So this seems like a cycle where the challenges that the European Union needs to sort of face, they're not able to face because of, and this was the case in earlier administrations, I will acknowledge that, but especially because of the Trump administration. So where do we break the cycle on this?
Well, I really rely on the Europeans to look after their interests. So I don't think it's fair for Americans to ask Europeans to do things that aren't net good for Europe. So I think that for instance, in the trade negotiations, you could have a really good argument as to whether it was in Europe's interest to have a trade war with the United States or to cut the deal at the tariff levels that they cut. Tariff levels, which, by the way, may end up collapsing because of legal issues in the United States. So I'm actually involved in the litigation that's challenging the tariffs, and so I take a close interest in that. But the point is that the Europeans then had to make difficult trade-offs. Do we think the trade war helps our people more than cutting this deal? And so then they make their choices. They're making choices and trade-offs in their trade negotiations with China too. So then if I'm in the European position, I'd say, if we want to be more independent and we want to have more clout in these negotiations with difficult Americans or even more difficult Chinese, what do we do? And one of the things I would then say is build up your businesses. Make them strong. Are your businesses built up and made stronger in these environments by more government subsidies? Maybe in very, very limited circumstances, but generally not. So one of the questions I've been asking a lot lately is, where is the business finance in Europe? Where are the, instead of to make these giant investments that need to be made in European companies that allow them to scale, so that when, the great German startup wants to scale, they don't feel like, well, I have to go now fly to Los Angeles to find the money to scale, because I can't find that money in Germany. Because I was talking in England last week with the AI advisor to the Prime Minister. And the AI advisor to the Prime Minister, who himself is in the business, said, and I'm about to fly to Ann Arbor, Michigan, because I'm going to get capital for an English company that wants to innovate from the people who invest the pension fund on behalf of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Because British pension funds aren't allowed to invest in British business. That's true. By the way, I think you'll find that in general, German pension funds can't invest in German business. So there are gigantic sums of German capital and British capital that are effectively immobilized. So they've got to go to the Americans, and then that gives the Americans clout. So I'd come back to the issue of, I'm all in favor of Europeans doing what they need to do in their net self-interest, because I believe in them as a free society. I want Americans to talk to them as peers. And so I want to see everything the Europeans can do that they think will give themselves the chance of building the most innovative, exciting, and open societies that they can build.
Right here.
This resonated very much to me because I was working with a company that used American funds a lot to scale up. It's called Flixbus, and we then bought actually Greyhound with lots of American money. But I want to come back to your very introduction initially when you said we need a new narrative. How can we find that narrative that we have difficulties getting people over to fix Greyhound? My younger son doesn't want to do the US because he doesn't feel welcome to study there anymore. What is the narrative for the next generation to make the US attractive again so they feel welcome there? They'd rather go to another country. Flixbus, we can staff India, we can staff Brazil. We have difficulties finding the talent who can manage a network. We fixed many other bus companies in the world. It's difficult for them to go to the US. They are afraid actually of the border control, some of them.
Yeah, I would say give us a little time, because I think that this fever might pass. Look, I teach at a university, and actually, students have been able to get their visas. They have. Some of the rhetoric around it sounds like you would be standing in line and never get your visa. And so there's a reality, and then there is a narrative or a rhetoric, as you've put it, right? And no, the perception. No, I'm completely in agreement with you there. But I can relate this a little bit to what happened after 9/11, because after 9/11, for a variety of reasons, we basically froze student visas, particularly from certain parts of the world, because the hijackers, a number of them were registered as students, but actually weren't students. And so there was a freeze. And I remember going with the president to Singapore during that period of time. And the Singaporean prime minister saying, having each of his ministers tell us that they went to an American college. Some of them, I'm a Trojan from USC and so forth and so on. And the president said, we have to fix this. We have to be able to get through. And we did fix it. So even under that extreme circumstance, we turned it around. I think you will find that this piece of it may turn around, but I will tell you, there is a sense in the United States, and we as universities have to understand this, that a lot of slots are going to not foreign students, Chinese students that could be going to American students. It doesn't happen to have the benefit of being true, But as you're saying, perception and narrative are everything. So we've got some work to do on this. But I would hope that within a year or so, as students continue to come to the United States and continue to have good experiences, because they're going to find that these universities are every bit as welcoming of them as they ever have been, and that their classmates are going to be very welcoming of them, that if nothing else, by word of mouth, this will turn around.
I want to make just one addendum to that. I agree completely with what Condi said. You made a broader comment about what's the narrative of hope. And for instance, I think that we're accustomed to thinking that there's a white collar and a blue collar world. These are American idioms. In fact, what's happening now is a no collar world. That is, production jobs in high technology manufacturing are as sophisticated and technically skilled as anything you would find in a so-called white collar world. The difference between the social stigma attached to working in production is a problem in the United States, for example. We have very serious problems in our skilled labor market. Germany actually has pioneered systems that actually do much better in creating pathways to the training of skilled labor than many parts of the United States. This is one of the things. One of the reasons why our society should work in closer partnership is because Europe in general has more manufacturing capacity and a stronger skilled labor market for production than the United States does. And the European market, the labor market, is underemployed, and the United States can't find the workers it needs, for example. And this is partly because a tribute to certain aspects of your system and a negative comment on certain aspects of our system. But we need to look to a world in which the notion of, well, if I didn't get into the right college, I can't get a good job. And instead of, it's all about the skills you have, and you can acquire those skills in many ways. And many of these skills actually are highly sophisticated. And we rethink the whole nature of education instead of, well, I didn't go to the right factory assembly line, to I can get the education I need for the skills I need at the time I need it, because I'm now empowered by these new technologies to reconceive our education systems in new ways. I think that's an exciting prospect, would be an exciting prospect for many young people who are worried about the social stigma of going down one track versus another track. And that's a lesson we need to learn in America.
I also think AI has real potential in K-12 education. You probably have read the stories of the American K-12 education system, and it's really a very sad story. Because I can look at your zip code and I can tell whether you're going to get a high quality education, and no democracy can survive that for very long. And so I'm hoping that to aid teachers in classrooms where there are too many students, where students are learning at variable speeds, you might be able to use these AI pilots to help the teachers. I think education is an area where the possibilities of the new technologies are very, very strong, and we ought to be exploiting it as much as we can. We do know that the Chinese are exploiting the introduction of these into their schools very, very quickly.
So I see I effectively primed the pump in the back of the room all the way. You're practically in the lake right there. So.
Is that the lake out there?
Yeah.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ayla. I'm doctoral candidate at Humboldt and also Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Fellow. I will read these questions as I want to be sure that I have question mark in the end.
Thank you.
So, as Europe works toward greater defense autonomy, how can it balance this with the need for strong transatlantic ties, given the US is a key ally? With European countries committing to 5% defense spending, can Europe secure its defense independently? Or should it continue to rely on US support? And latest question, with shifting US leadership, can Europe count on the US as a reliable partner, especially in the face of threats from Russia? Thank you so much.
Sure. It's interesting, there are lots of criticisms of European defense spending, which Condi mentioned and are right. Actually, the total, the total of European defense spending is extremely inefficiently spent in relationship to output. Europe has internal problems within Europe of combining and joining forces to efficiently utilize the scale of its own defense spending already. Because, of course, defense is a classic area for national patronage. And everyone in the defense industry knows this. Basically a lot of defense spending was semi-symbolic, and you'd spend it on your preferred companies at home, and it was a way of channeling government money to favored national companies. I get it. And in a period when there wasn't really an urgent threat, the politics of that were pretty hard to answer. Well, now it's kind of serious. And now the arguments for pooling resources in more efficient ways are very strong. Yes, there will be very strong temptations then. Europe should only buy from Europe. America should only buy from America. This will hurt America and it will hurt Europe. And it would be a fundamental strategic mistake. So I'm very realistic about the politics of defense spending. But I think we're in a new era and we need to try to reconceive this. We're seeing some really interesting examples, though, of how companies are reconceiving this. For instance, there are German companies now that are manufacturing parts of significant portions of the F-35 fighter, and that may end up being important manufacturing partners of, say, Lockheed for lots of different foreign markets. We're developing new thoughts of co-production, but not just in these exquisite defense technologies, but in a lot of these startups. You look at a company like Helsing or Rheinmetall, and of course, a lot of them are discovering none of them can do it all alone. And so basically, we need a generational shift from cushy national patronage of the favored defense company in an era of no threat, where this money is spent extremely inefficiently, to kind of an era where you actually are worried about a possible war. And then people do the kinds of things that they do when they're really worried. And that means that there's going to be an exceptional degree of cooperation, including, in my view, with Ukrainian defense industries. One of the reasons Ukraine can be a vital partner in Europe is Ukraine is now going to field the largest army in Europe. So the notion that you can have a strategy for European security in which you don't use the largest army in Europe as a core partner would make no sense. And so then if Ukraine is naturally going to develop a powerful defense industry, it's going to naturally, though, need all kinds of relationships with supply chains throughout Europe. And this is an important source of opportunity. And to be very blunt, leverage the Europeans have in their bargaining with the Americans.
If I could just underscore something that Philip just touched on lightly, it's also time for all of our defense industries to rethink some of what we're doing in terms of technology. Not everything has to be a contract that's an RFP, or request for proposals, that takes 3 years to make the award. You then spend all your time trying to lobby to keep it, to get it funded in the Congress, and by that time, most young startups are dead. And so the procurement processes in the United States, in the Pentagon, are also broken. And there are now several efforts to change that so that the Pentagon can take advantage of some of the really innovative younger companies that are producing solutions that don't take so long.
So we are virtually at the end of our time. I'm getting the sign that we are at the end of our time, but I'm ignoring that sign. And I would be remiss if I didn't put this question to both of you. The project that you have embarked upon is, I think, fundamentally an optimistic one, and I applaud you for that, because we could use more optimism. It seems to me that a precondition for success, at least on our side of the ocean, is going to be a diminution in the polarization that we are seeing. We saw a horrible event the other day when a conservative pundit was assassinated. We've had legislators in Minnesota assassinated. We could go on. And I am curious if you have any hope regarding the passing of this really horrible phase in our national political life?
Yes, but it's a really serious issue. So I mean, you can't just kind of wave it off. The American society is tense and uneasy, and so then you have to ask yourself, of course, all the op-ed pages are full of calls for calming and unifying rhetoric, and of course that's right. I really think it's important, though, to restore the reputation of government and of government competence. It is a fair criticism to say that over the last 20 years, a lot of people have experienced in America a sense that government has made a number of really huge mistakes. And that's the kind of what they've lived with. They've lived with a situation in which on various issues, it just seems like free government doesn't work. Democratic government doesn't work. And so there's a hunger for panaceas on both left and right. And so then the challenge to us, and it's a challenge here in Germany too, is you've got to show that free government can actually work, can actually get stuff done, not just make pronouncements. We're going to be running a conference next month on competence in government in America. Can we actually get stuff done? And it focuses on innovation and ability to do action at the state and local level. You've got this in Germany with things to do with repairs in your infrastructure, your railroads, and so on. We have a lot of serious problems of our own. I think for too long, there was a sense that all politicians had to do was have a position, a posture, a pose. They could strike a pose. They could have the right talking points that match the coalition line. But they didn't really have to actually get things done as long as they said the right things and represented the right nuances to their constituencies. We need to return to, as one of the participants in the meeting put it today, government that demonstrates results that are vivid and that people can see. You pick your spots. Of course, you can't do it. It's really hard. You can't do it across the board. But you pick your spots where you think maybe you can get some results that people will be able to see and recognize and start building back the reputation for the competence of free governments to get things done.
Obviously, I'm very concerned about the polarization too. I think that the people want to blame social media for it, but social media is an accelerant of underlying tensions in the society. I think some of which come from this sense that elites and, quote, common people are not in the same boat any longer. When Donald Trump won in 2016, I had a number of colleagues who said, maybe we should go see what those people in Alabama think. Now, Alabama's my home state. If you have to do an archaeological or anthropological dig on your fellow citizens, we've lost touch with one another. And I don't think we know each other very much anymore. We no longer have the kind of unifying experiences like service in the military that tend to overcome differences of status in life. We no longer go to the same schools. If you are of means, you will send your kids to a school where the schools are good and the houses are expensive. If you're really wealthy, you'll send them to a private school. And who's stuck in failing neighborhood schools? Poor kids. And a lot of them minority kids. And we don't even have sometimes the same health care. We have the concierge doctor who you can afford if you're well off. It used to be if you had a job, you were going to have pretty good health care. And so we have a lot of breaks in the social contract, I would say. And that is what is causing then polarization, as people were encouraged to go to their own tribe, and then social media helps you to go to your own tribe, where you only talk to people who think like you. And then when you encounter people who think differently, you think they're either stupid or venal. And the most extreme form of that then is the violence that you see. So I think the one thing that makes me optimistic is that I'm all for Philip and the conference we're going to do on government competence, but an awful lot of competence does not rest in Washington, D.C. It rests at the state and local level. The United States is fortunate to have a truly federalized system. Not every state operates efficiently, but most states operate more efficiently than Washington. And I think it may have been emblematic of this when the strongest voice for unity and for lowering the temperature and for reaching out to each other after the horrible events with Charlie Kirk came from Governor Cox of Utah. Governor Cox has been on a campaign for several years now to get the temperature turned down. He and his opponent in the race for governor in Utah actually did a common public service announcement in which they said, we promise to keep the rhetoric low. We promise to accept the outcome of the elections. We're going to go after each other as hard as we can, but we're going to recognize that we may be political opponents, but we are not enemies. And there's a reason that his voice is now very much a part of what we're doing to heal after the terrible events. And so I just want to say to those of you who maybe don't know the United States quite that well, if you really ever want to see a great emblem of what de Tocqueville called in the United States the spirit of constitutionalism, he said, and the Americans organizing themselves into these associations, these voluntary associations, he called them just to do good. Go to a medium-sized city and go to the gala for the Children's Hospital, and you will see the business community there, and you will see civil society there, and you'll see all walks of life there, and they'll all be there for the same purpose. And so civil society in the United States is still strong. We're going to have to learn to talk to each other. We're going to have to learn not to yell at each other. And most importantly, we're going to have to learn that we're all Americans or all Germans or all British. And that's probably the most important thing we can do in democracy.
Well, that is a great place to end. And I couldn't agree more. So I want to thank you, Condoleezza Rice and Philip Zelikow, for joining us. I really want to thank the Hoover Institution for being a great partner in putting together this event today. And I want to thank you all for joining us. We are